All right, buckle up, everyone, because today we're taking a deep dive into something that's probably got you feeling a little wobbly just thinking about it.
Oh, yeah.
Vertigo and dizziness. Now, we're basing this deep dive on some really fascinating work by a specialist named Dr. Latorre, and he's got some pretty strong opinions on these conditions.
Some might even say controversial.
Yeah, maybe a little controversial, but that's what makes this so interesting, right? He really challenges the way we traditionally think about vertigo and dizziness.
Definitely. His focus on the inner ear as the root cause is, it's not exactly mainstream thinking.
Right. So let's start there. For those who maybe haven't experienced a full-blown vertigo episode, can you break down what we're actually talking about here? What's true vertigo as opposed to just feeling lightheaded or dizzy?
Okay, so true vertigo, it's not just feeling off balance, it's this very distinct illusion of movement.
Like the room is spinning?
Exactly, like the room is spinning around you or you feel like you're spinning within the room. And this is where Dr. Latorre gets really insistent.
Insistent.
Yeah, he's adamant that all true vertigo, every single case, originates in the inner ear.
Wow, okay, so no exceptions. But isn't dizziness a pretty common symptom with all sorts of things? Why is he so focused on the inner ear?
Well, his reasoning gets really interesting here. He goes deep into the anatomy and physiology, particularly the vestibular system.
The vestibular system, that's in the inner ear.
Right. It's responsible for our sense of balance.
Got it.
And it's this incredibly complex system, super delicate, with tiny hair cells that detect movement.
Like little sensors.
Exactly. They send signals to the brain about where we are in space.
Makes sense.
And Dr. Latorre argues that when this system gets disrupted, it throws off those signals.
Ah, so that's what creates the spinning sensation.
That's the idea. It's those false signals from the inner ear that make you feel like you're moving, even though you're not.
So it's not just that the inner ear can be involved in vertigo. He's saying it's always involved.
Always. He even challenges that common belief about positional vertigo.
You mean where certain head movements trigger it?
Yeah, the traditional explanation is that tiny crystals in the ear get dislodged.
Oh, right. I've heard of that.
He calls that the legend of the wandering pebble. He argues that even positional vertigo is tied back to the inner ear, but in a different way.
Okay, now I'm really curious. If those crystals aren't usually the culprit, what is? What's causing this inner ear disruption?
Well, he points to something called endolymphatic hydrops.
Hydrops.
Yeah, it's basically an excess buildup of fluid in the inner ear.
Interesting.
And he believes this fluid buildup, this hydrops, is what messes with those delicate hair cells, sending those wonky signals to the brain.
So every time you get that spinning sensation, it's essentially a fluid problem.
According to Dr. Latorre's research and his clinical observations, yes. He actually goes so far as to say that every single case of recurring vertigo, it all comes back to hydrops.
Wow, that's a pretty bold statement. I imagine that's got some other doctors scratching their heads.
He's definitely ruffled some feathers, yeah.
But he's not just making this up, right? He's baking this on years of experience and actually studying the inner ear.
Oh, absolutely. He's got the data and the clinical experience to back up his claims. He's not afraid to challenge the status quo.
So to recap, we've got this super intricate system in our inner ear that's responsible for balance.
Right.
And when something disrupts it, boom, you get vertigo. And the main culprit behind that disruption, at least in recurring cases, seems to be this fluid buildup, hydrops.
Yep, that's the core of his argument.
Got it. But there's got to be more to the story, right? I mean, vertigo could be a terrifying experience.
Absolutely. There's a whole other layer to this that we need to unpack.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
It's the psychological component.
The psychological component. You mean like how we react to the spinning?
More than just a reaction. It's about how our mental and emotional state can actually influence the experience of vertigo itself.
All right, now we're getting into some really interesting territory.
Oh yeah, this is where things get fascinating.
I can't wait to hear more about this. Let's dive in.
Let's do it. Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? How intertwined our physical sensations and our emotional responses can be.
Right. And with vertigo, it seems like that connection is especially strong.
It really is. Dr. Latorre talks about how the fear and anxiety that often come with vertigo, they can actually create this vicious cycle.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, you have that terrifying spinning sensation, right?
Yeah.
And naturally, you develop this fear of it happening again.
Makes sense. I mean, who wouldn't be afraid of that?
Exactly. But that fear itself, that anticipation, it can actually increase your sensitivity.
Sensitivity to what?
To even the slightest disturbances in your inner ear.
So you're more likely to have another episode because you're afraid of having another episode.
It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Wow, that's wild.
Yeah, your brain is on high alert, constantly looking for any sign of that spinning.
Which ironically makes it more likely to happen.
Exactly. And that's why Dr. Latorre, he really emphasizes managing that psychological component, that fear and anxiety.
Okay, but how do you do that? It's not like you can just tell yourself not to be afraid when the room is spinning around you.
Right, it's not that simple. He suggests a multifaceted approach.
Multifaceted. Okay, I like that.
It starts with really understanding the underlying mechanisms of vertigo.
So, like we talked about, knowing that it's often caused by a temporary disruption in the inner ear.
Yeah, and that it's not something more sinister, like a stroke or something.
Right, it takes away some of the mystery.
And the fear of the unknown.
It's like when you hear a creaking noise in your house at night.
Exactly. You're less scared if you know it's just the pipes settling, not a burglar.
Love that analogy.
So understanding helps. But beyond that, he recommends things like mindfulness, relaxation exercises.
To kind of calm the nervous system down.
Exactly. He also stresses working with a healthcare provider who really gets the psychological side of things, who can help you develop personalized coping strategies.
So it's not just about treating the physical symptoms, it's about treating the whole person. I like that. So we've established that Dr. Latore is pretty skeptical of some traditional explanations for vertigo.
Yeah, he's not afraid to challenge the status quo.
So I'm guessing his treatment recommendations might be a bit unconventional too.
You're catching on. He's definitely not a fan of what he sees as overly aggressive treatments.
Aggressive how?
Things like injecting medications into the inner ear to basically disable it.
Whoa, really? That sounds intense.
Is a pretty drastic measure.
Why is he so against that approach?
He believes it carries significant risks, for one thing.
Yeah, I could see that.
And he argues that many cases of vertigo can be managed effectively with less invasive methods.
What kind of methods are we talking about?
He's a big proponent of lifestyle modifications, for starters.
Lifestyle modifications? Like what?
Things like dietary changes to reduce fluid retention,
Okay, so cutting back on salt, things like that.
Exactly. Stress management techniques, exercises to improve balance and coordination.
So really getting at the root cause.
That's the goal. He might also recommend medications, but he emphasizes those are tools to be used alongside lifestyle changes.
Not a magic bullet.
Right. It's not a quick fix. It's about giving your body the best chance to heal itself.
Makes sense.
He's also a huge advocate for something called vestibular rehabilitation therapy.
Vestibular rehab, what's that?
It involves specific exercises that basically retrain your brain.
Retrain your brain to do what?
To process signals from your inner ear more effectively.
So it's like physical therapy for your balance system.
Exactly. And it can be really effective for a lot of people.
It sounds like he's taking a very comprehensive approach.
Yeah, he doesn't believe in a one-size-fits-all solution.
He wants to understand the individual and what's causing their vertigo.
Exactly. He wants to tailor the treatment to the person.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about vertigo, the actual spinning sensation. But what about that other type of dizziness, the subjective feeling of unsteadiness?
Oh, yes, the chronic disequilibrium.
Chronic disequilibrium, is that what he calls it?
That's his term for it, and this is where his insights get even more intriguing.
All right, I'm ready. Tell me more about this chronic disequilibrium.
Well, he talks about these two specific parts of the inner ear.
Okay.
The saccule and the utricle.
The saccule and utricle.
Yeah, and you can think of them like tiny levels inside your head.
Oh, interesting.
They're responsible for sensing linear motion, like moving forward and backward.
Got it.
And your head's position in relation to gravity.
So if those levels are off.
If those levels are off, you're going to feel unsteady. Even if you're not actually moving. Yeah.
Even if you're standing still.
Exactly. And again, Dr. Latore believes this disruption, like with vertigo, often comes back to that fluid buildup we talked about, the hydrops.
So hydrops can mess with both those spinning sensations and this feeling of unsteadiness.
That's what he's suggesting. He thinks the excess fluid can interfere with those delicate sensory mechanisms in the saccule and utricle.
Sending inaccurate signals to the brain.
Exactly. So your brain's getting all this conflicting information about where your body is in space.
Okay, but if it's all about the inner ear, why does it feel so different from true vertigo? Why that unsteadiness without the actual spinning?
Right. Good question. And this is where Dr. Latore's thinking gets really interesting.
Okay, lay it on me.
He suggests that subjective dizziness, it's more about your brain's interpretation of those faulty signals.
Interpretation.
Yeah, it's like your inner ear is whispering, hey, something feels a bit off, but your brain is shouting back, whoa, we're about to fall.
So it's not just the physical sensation itself, it's how we perceive it.
Precisely. It's our perception that really throws us off balance, and this explains why people with subjective dizziness, they often feel worse in situations where their brain is already a bit uncertain,
Uncertain.
Like wide open spaces, unfamiliar environments, places where they don't have those visual cues to help them feel grounded.
Oh, right, that makes sense. If your brain is already on edge, it's going to overreact to those signals from the inner ear.
Exactly. And here's another interesting observation he's made. Trying too hard to maintain your balance can actually make the feeling of unsteadiness worse.
Wait, really? I would think focusing on your balance would help you feel steadier.
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But what he's found is that when you hyper-focus on your balance, you're actually flooding your brain with even more sensory information.
So it's like trying to listen to a quiet conversation in a noisy room.
Exactly. It becomes harder to discern the signal from the noise.
So the key is to relax. Trust your body's natural balance mechanisms.
Let go of that need to micromanage every movement.
Now, I know some people might be skeptical that a feeling like subjective dizziness can actually have a physical root in the inner ear.
Oh, I'm sure.
They might think it's all in your head, so to speak.
Right, and Dr. Latore understands that skepticism, but he points to these specific tests he used to do.
What kind of tests?
Oh, things like measuring eye movements, balance reactions, even the perception of verticality. And he found that people with subjective dizziness, they consistently showed subtle but measurable differences in how they processed sensory information compared to people without dizziness.
So he was proving that there's an actual physiological component to this feeling.
Exactly. It's not just imagined.
Okay, so let's say someone comes to Dr. Latore struggling with this chronic disequilibrium, this persistent feeling of unsteadiness. What kind of advice or treatment might he offer?
Well, it's likely to be a combination of approaches, kind of like with vertigo.
So holistic approach.
Definitely. He'd likely start with lifestyle modifications to manage stress and anxiety.
Things like regular exercise, meditation, maybe therapy.
Exactly. Things to help calm the nervous system, reduce that fear that often amplifies the unsteadiness.
It's about empowering them to take control rather than feeling like a victim of their symptoms.
Precisely. And he might recommend medications in some cases, but again, medication would be just one piece of the puzzle.
Not the whole solution.
Right. And of course, education is key.
Education about
Helping them understand what's happening in their bodies, reassuring them that their symptoms are real.
even if they don't always align with what's easily measurable.
Exactly. It's about validating their experience.
So whether it's vertigo or subjective dizziness, Dr. Latore's approach is really about looking at the whole person, recognizing that mind-body connection.
Absolutely. He's not just treating symptoms, he's treating the individual.
And, what I find particularly fascinating is his emphasis on the role of fear and anxiety.
Oh, yeah, that's key.
It's not just that they make the symptoms feel worse, he's suggesting that they can actually contribute to the problem itself, creating that vicious cycle we talked about.
Right, that fear and anxiety, they can actually make you more susceptible to future episodes.
It really makes you wonder, if we could learn to manage our anxiety more effectively, could we break free from that cycle and significantly reduce the impact of these conditions on our lives?
That's a really profound question, and I think it's something we all need to be thinking about.
It is. And it's a great place to leave our listeners today. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into the world of vertigo and dizziness, and I hope you all learned something new. Thanks for joining us.